Welcome to the Cyber Psychology Seminar Series at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. My name is Dr. Julie Ansis, and I am the Director of the Cyber Psychology Program at NJIT. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping rules. One, please mute your microphone for now. We will have question and answer in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the presentation. Please put your questions in the chat with the word question in the prefix or Q in the prefix, so I know to differentiate your questions from statements. The Cyber Psychology Seminar Series is designed to showcase the many facets of research and scholarship within the field of cyber psychology. This series features some of the nation's leading experts at the emerging intersection of psychology and technology. It is a pleasure to have with us today Dr. Brian Keum. Dr. Keum is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Welfare at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. He received his Ph.D. in counseling psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and completed his internship at the University of Maryland Counseling Center, which I could attest is a great place to do your internship. Prior to his doctoral education, Dr. Keum earned his MA in mental health counseling from Columbia University Teachers College and a BS in anatomy and cell biology from McGill University. Using an interdisciplinary framework, drawing from theories of racism, online communication, human-computer interactions, and violence, Dr. Keum's primary research examines the biopsychosocial impact of online racism and racial violence in today's digital society. He is particularly interested in exploring the health and mental health implications of online racism among developmentally vulnerable and digitally connected populations, including adolescents and adults of color. His research has been funded and recognized by multiple divisions of the American Psychological Association, the American Psychological Foundation, the Asian American Psychological Association, the Society for Psychotherapy Research, Active Minds, and by Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. This is our last seminar this semester. We're going to have more in the spring. I will put some information about how to subscribe to our announcement mailing list, following us on Eventbrite, and also we have a new YouTube channel called the Cyber Psychology Center, and I'll put all that information in the chat box as well. So be on the lookout for additional talks in the spring. So Dr. Keum, thank you so much. I'm grateful that you have agreed to join us today for your lecture, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Yeah, thank you so much for the welcome and the introduction. In the interest of time, I'm just going to start sharing my PowerPoint and then get right into it. So good morning to everyone. Again, I'm at UCLA Luskin right now as an assistant professor there. And so the talk that I will be giving to you today is about online racism and some of the various ways that I've been sort of approaching this topic from a more mental health perspective. It's becoming sort of a more attended issue, although it's not new. It's been going on for many, many years, ever since the internet was developed and has been proliferated. So it's kind of there's been a little bit of an oversight in terms of how it's been happening, but I think it's great that we have more attention on this topic as well. So some of the funding organizations that I just wanted to kind of portray here in the beginning. Just before getting into the topic here, so the racism that I conceptualize in this presentation also factors in sort of the contextual larger systems at play. And so the so-called systemic racism that all of us are talking about nowadays, but it's really about sort of how these systems also in and of itself have inherent power differentials for different racial groups in our society. And so oppression and sort of marginalization is felt more viscerally by racial minority individuals than for those in power, sort of the white individuals, in particular in the United States as well. So just wanted to give that a heads up before going into the talk. And so one thing that I wanted to share in terms of just, situating you in terms of the how online racism kind of can be sort of seen in many different ways. So this is a map of the geography of hate. And this was actually developed in 2012 by Stevens. Unfortunately, the map has been taken down. I don't know why, but it's been kind of a sort of in 2012, this was sort of a really refreshing way of looking at how is the internet really proliferating a lot of hate and this is a comprehensive view of that across the United States. And so the red areas, you can see how there's more hate in these geolocations than in other locations. Of course, this is also differentiated more by population density as well. But it just gives you a bird's eye overview of what the hate is doing on the internet across the nation as well. But within that context, so back in 2012, why I really got interested in this topic was um, in my master's program, we were talking a lot about the impact of racism on mental health. There's been a lot of issues about how people are experiencing mental health difficulties based on that, sort of seeing videos and sort of images and discussions that are racist in nature. And these are some of the examples that I could pull, for the past decade. Of course, we know this year, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor has been in the news and social media, for many, many, many times, and it's been such a controversy. But this is, again, not a new phenomenon, right? This, people perceiving these police brutality and victimization on the internet, it's been going on for many, many, many years. And so the pandemic has also kind of created this syndemic kind of situation where it's all coming together. But again, the point that I want to stress here is that this is not new. Some more examples here about how these white supremacy motivated shootings in different years, they have been kind of really also took firestorm in social media. Many people sort of were perceiving these events from different locations. And it's been really having an impact on a lot of the people in this country, especially for racial minority individuals. And so at this point, sort of, how is the research sort of faring in terms of understanding this process and how the racism on the internet, how it impacts, people's well-being, how they view the society, their mental health implications. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a rundown of, some of the lines of research that I've been seeing. So as far back as 2002, Beck actually started talking about cyber racism a little bit, and then that's been kind of been discussed among the scholars from then on. But since then, there's been a lot of writings about race and the internet, how kids or adolescents develop about their racial identities through the internet, their social media interactions. There are some people like Jesse Daniels, Patricia Greenfield, who's been writing about this. And then there's been sort of a lot of qualitative studies looking at the online forums and message boards, because it the advantage of the online social media platform is that you get to see these discussions in real time, and you're able to pull those discussions and actually analyze them using qualitative methods. There's been a lot of approach to that. And of course, the findings are pretty, unilateral, is that there's a lot of, racist messages, particularly toward certain topics. And I think they've examined this in sort of gaming message boards, also in sports message boards. There's been a lot of racist connotations there. And then there has been some movement made in terms of, examining race in cyberbullying studies. And so Dr. Vandisha Tynes at USC actually has been kind of spearheading this topic as well. But she's been overwhelmingly finding a lot of negative implications about online racism and racism cyberbullying for adolescents. And that's been kind of a detrimental sort of collection of evidence that, that's been coming to fruition. And then there has been sort of also this attention on how the online structures and the internet, and even to some extent how sort of games are developed, which I will, it's right there. They have this inherent ways of portraying sort of, racial minority individuals in a very negative light. Or for example, in games, you have black or brown people being portrayed as, criminals most of the time. And so how does that over time shape people's perceptions? And then the internet, of course, Safia Noble has a book out that talks about this, how even, the various structures of the internet actually promote more racist ways of interacting with people online. When you first search for something, even as images, sometimes when you search for something that's related to criminals or something, it's usually the sort of the people of color that comes up. And so the search engines themselves do have this algorithm that's not really sort of culturally sensitive or competent. And so those are some of the lines of research there. If you want to check out more, you can of course check their work out. But the way that I've been approaching this topic is more from the mental health perspective. And there has been a recent sort of review article out looking at all of the online hate literature. And some of the implication there is that there is less attention on the target's perspective, so the victim's perspective, how it's impacting them in their lives and in their sort of everyday functioning in society. And so since then, sort of some of the questions that I've been asking was, first of all, sort of, how do people kind of understand, how the internet has influenced racism experiences for them? And so this was sort of a qualitative design study that I've conducted. And it basically collected data from about 132 participants who are racial minority individuals. And it was a simple study, really just asking about, how do you believe that the internet has influenced racism for you? How have you experienced sort of online racism? And, some of the findings that I'll pull from here for you is that, first of all, there is a collection of themes of experiences of online racism they're experiencing, and including, racism in the online media, negative racial stereotyping, racist humor, and then of course, racist propaganda by online groups that are, proliferating these propaganda ideas. And also the big thing here was the vicarious observations, sort of, and now because of the exposure to a lot of contents and different interactions in online spaces, this vicarious piece becomes really huge. Um, there are also positive influences that people talked about, right? So you also have more opportunities to, be educated, have more public awareness. There's more intergroup contact. There you can also confront different ideals of racism, and then there's also this polarization of anti-racism groups for advocacy as well. And this I will talk more about in a later point. Um, and then, of course, because psychologists love talking about negative influences, but negative influences themselves have been really the hallmark of this finding. People were just really discouraged by how much hate there is online. First of all, there's just so much accessibility to this racist content. So it's inevitable to be exposed to this, and you sometimes don't ask for it, but it's there. And so it all becomes sort of kind of an everyday interaction for some people. And then there is this notion that the people believe that the internet did provide a platform for racist voices to be proliferated. And of course, this was back in 2000, this data was collected back in around 2013 and 14. But now we know that this is not, we don't need a study to find that out. I mean, it's true that this, the internet gives platform for many, many voices to come out, including racism as well. And so one thing that I will highlight is the platform for racist voices here. And in terms of how virtual courage was something that a lot of participants were mentioning, it's like what they were saying was that it's like when people go online, it's like they're drunk and then they're not able to say whatever they want, like alcohol, giving them this virtual courage to say whatever they want without actually feeling accountable for what they said. So some of the quotes that really summarize some of those domains for you, in terms of platform for racist voices, it has only made it worse. Racists kind of hide behind the veil of anonymity, which I will talk a little bit more about. they're also, easy to find like-minded racists far more easily. And of course, this has implications for later studies as well. And then, of course, again, right, the internet is like alcohol. It gives people and racists virtual courage. And then in terms of greater accessibility to racism, characteristics like being it's unavoidable, violent words and deeds going back and forth, forced to see, right? I think that's a big one because you're not forced to see racism even when you don't want to. Spread more quickly and over a larger geographical area. So something happening in, for example, here in New Mexico, you see it. Something happening in Florida, you see it. So it's really everywhere. Right? So we begin to kind of characterize some of the attributes of online racism, and these are some of it that was kind of distilled from that study. And so the question for us was then, at least for my research team was, what is the theory, right, behind racist expressions on the internet? And some of the questions that you might ask is, there is a lot of hate on the internet. So where does it come from? What does it represent? So is it that people are more racist on the internet? Or is it that the internet attracts racist individuals? Is it that the internet is different from reality, or is it similar? And the other piece that I think some writing has been done was, does the internet provide backstage for backstage racism to occur? That is that in real life and offline experiences, people put on this politically correct expressions of racial dynamics. But then on the internet, when you don't have those social norms in place or public awareness, then you have the freedom to say whatever you want. And people call that kind of the backstage racism. And I think that's been also something that the internet has really afforded for many people. So the way that I've approached, online racism and the expressions of racism on the internet is really sort of based on online anonymity. And this was kind of also driven by some of the qualitative study that I just talked to you about. And it's different than just anonymity itself. So not being able to see another person or not knowing that person or her identity, right? It's really about that this and online anonymity condition allows people to manipulate your online profiles. They make you believe that offline social norms do not apply to the internet, and then you kind of don't take the online interactions seriously. It's just fooling people, fooling around. It's just jokes. It's not serious. And then you can also abandon these interactions at any time if things go in a different direction that you had intended. And so it is more than just not being able to see. It's this that, oh, if we're playing a game here, rules do not apply. I will always do what I want, and that's and I have the right to do that all the time. And so people also sort of have this belief that, there is, this digital freedom of speech. They can say whatever they want, and they should not be dinged for that. And so based on this online anonymity framework, this was sort of the theoretical framework that we published. And this looks a little bit complex, so I'm going to just give you some summaries of this model. And so the online anonymity is not a new phenomenon. It's actually based on the theories of how people behave in anonymous conditions. And so if you treat the internet as that medium, disinhibition can happen. So what that means is that people behave radically different than they actually do in their own usual social settings. And then there are online deindividuation, which means that your identity gets dispersed into this anonymous condition. And then you try to recreate your identity by sort of, sort of emphasizing your beliefs and then your norms that govern your identity in the online space. And that can have implications for sort of racial stereotyping and racism interactions as well. And then the big thing here is the group polarization. To really be able to sort of represent yourself on the internet, you have to kind of find people who share your beliefs and your identities. And so those senses of group and belonging becomes even more heightened. And that can have more implications for how people behave in these racial dynamic situations. And so just to go a little bit further into this, so online disinhibition, as I said, it really sort of is a simple process of you being in an online anonymous condition. And then you kind of suddenly have this freedom or sense that I can do whatever I want. So I might say something racist to this other individual. And so we see this anecdotal example a lot, and I'm sure that some of you might have seen this too. I didn't know that my family, friends, or partner had these racist beliefs when they post something on Facebook, and you see that, and you're kind of surprised, like, where did this come from? Here's a more community example. There was an article in New York Times about this. A school in Minnesota. Nobody talked about race at the school, but then somebody started posting a racist slur in their social media space, and it just blew up, right? So it's this notion that you go online, now it's like a different person. It's like you didn't even know this person. Online de-individuation. So again, this is where, because you're in an anonymous condition, your identity, it feels like you have to reinforce your identity and belief norms. And so this means that, for example, for white individuals, your sense of identity comes with this identification of privilege and dominance in society. If we, go with the theoretical models there with, social dominance orientation, justification, suppression model of prejudice, but it is not a sort of a puzzle that that sense comes with some identity of privilege, and so that might get heightened. And so then how do you portray that on the internet? Well, you can see how that can lead to more racist expressions in your dynamics, and we see this a lot in gaming as well, and there's been a lot of writing on that. One thing that does lead into more is this stereotyping. So people sort of, engage in a lot of stereotyping because their identities, if you do emphasize those heightened norms and identities, then they are really more based on how people stereotype those identities and beliefs. And so you might be interacting more in a way that you're stereotyping other individuals. And we hear some couple examples, which are old now, but have been kind of, I mean, it's the internet is littered with these kinds of examples, so you don't really have to go looking for them. And then finally, we do have the group polarization and online racism here, which means that, as an extension of the previous de-individuation, you really feel like, the premise here is that you might need to kind of conform your in-group membership and then thereby, out-group distinction. So where the stereotyping and all of those come in play. And so, if you are able to find other people on the internet who, again, who can share those like-minded beliefs, and that actually helps you reinforce your group identity and your sort of identity as a person, then you're likely to more join in those coalition building, right? Now, the negative implication there is that, let's say those beliefs also include, inklings of white supremacy or racism beliefs. It gets polarized. And so now we have, and this is not, again, not new, the white supremacy hate groups are all over the internet. They have found new home on the internet, and it has been their safe breeding ground for people to engage in white supremacy acts and belief spreading. And so that's a clear example of this happening where to the maximum. So here's a summary of some of those lines of theoretical mechanisms there in terms of why people would engage more in racist expressions. And these are the three things that I talked about. But what I will just stress here is that all of these processes do not occur in vacuum. It's not that everybody becomes a newfound person on the internet and are able to say those things that are racist or do things that are racist. I believe that it's more of a vehicle, and it's really has allowed, right, these racist ideologies to play out and more pervasively and explicitly. And really, where do those attitudes and beliefs come from? It really comes from the people that you know in your society, the neighbors, your friends, the network that you have. Everybody engages in social media and the internet nowadays, and so it is ultimately a reflection of our society. And so you cannot separate what's happening on the internet in terms of online racism from what's happening on the grounds as well in our society. And so they're all interconnected. And so the issue here is that for people who have racist beliefs and ideologies, now it becomes even more heightened. When you go on the internet, you do have the internet as a tool as a racist platform for racist voices. So based on that framework, so the goal from sort of my research agenda was to really understand then how do people sort of experience online racism, and ultimately what is the psychological impact and how does it impact their sort of well-being. So, at that time when I was getting into this, there wasn't really a measure, a research measure to really assess, that perspective. And so the one thing that I did was create this measure. And so by using the qualitative data and some of the frameworks that I've just outlined, I created the perceived online racism scale. And these were some of the questions that we were asking. And so we really needed a rigorous psychological measure that really gets at the experiences of online racism that are unique and can be differentiated from offline racism, so the in-person experiences. And so these were some of the themes from which the scale was derived. And it was all based on the previous things that I've just talked about. And, just going to give you sort of a rundown of this process. It can be too tedious with the specifics here, but it's really using the best practices of measure development, psychological measure development. And we kind of started with 134 items that all represent different experiences of online racism. And then we have whittled it down using statistical analysis and model testing, and then looking at how the validity of the online racism experience relate to other aspects of experiences that it should be related to, and that it's theory driven and evidence based. And so some of the aspects that we tested in conjunction to online racism was things like psychological distress, perceived stress, offline racism, are they also correlated? Racism related stress, and also belief in a non-just world. And so the hypothesis here that everything would be more positively related to each other. So online racism being positively related to all of these different experiences. So about 1,000 participants participated in this study, and here are some demographic characteristics here. And basically, we run factor analyses using best practices to find a 3-factor model, which means this measure contains 3 subscales, each representing some uniqueness of the measure, but also they also have similar attributes throughout all of the items that it can also be used as a total scale measure. And the psychometric properties were pretty good. And we also found measurement invariance, which sort of tells us that that the scale actually operates or has evidence to operate equivalently across at least the Black, Asian, Latinx, and multiracial groups, and of course across women and men, as well as different age groups that you see here at the bottom. And so here's more evidence of the measurement invariance. One thing that I'll note about this is that women were reporting significantly higher levels of online racism than men. And for racial groups, Black individuals and Latinx individuals were reporting significantly higher online racism than the other groups. And so the first factor here, the first subscale of the measure really gets at sort of your personal experiences of racial cyber aggression. So you actually being victimized on the internet in many different ways. And so, here's a real life example of what I got when I was actually doing this study. Somebody emailed me saying, what do you mean you are saying, things like I wanted to do the survey, but but it says I must be non-white, and sort of arguing with me why that is, even though this person seems to be white. And so kind of sort of, undermining, right, sort of what I'm trying to do here. And so this was an interesting experience. Vicarious experiences of racial cyber aggression. So sort of seeing other racial minority individuals being victimized in the online space. And again, this came up in our qualitative theme. And this is actually one of the big aspects of what, when you go online, now there's a lot of vicarious experiences that you do get. And so this is one aspect that represents this. And here are some examples, right? Imagine, being a Black man or Black person going online and seeing this, right? All this talk about how they're talking about Black individuals, what would you feel? What would you think? It's, so that's that vicarious impact of racism. And then here's a reaction to that, that they're just sick of it, right? You see this all the time on the internet. People are getting sick of it. It's really highlighting how people are reacting to this. And then the third factor here is the online mediated exposure to racist reality. And this, we believe, is the most unique factor of this measure, because it is a mediated exposure to the racist things in the society, and mostly at the group and systemic levels. And so things like police brutality, injustice in the criminal system, unfairness in the financial gains for racial minority individuals. These aren't experiences that interact every day, when you're out and about in the streets. You're going somewhere, you're not gonna suddenly think about this, right? But when you go on the internet, there's a lot of content and even, events that happen in other geographic locations that you also encounter, that now brings this to your smartphone or your computer, to your fingertips. So now this is becoming even more, heightening of these exposures. And that is, I think, something that is really different than how traditional media and offline racism has not been sort of impacting as much. But now this is really given the platform for people to be exposed in this way. And it's not just about United States as well. Something happening in different countries now gets shared even faster through social media than traditional media or other media outlets. And so that's something that has been really coming up as a unique experience here. And these are, again, the examples that I talked to you about in the beginning, but again, they come up here. And so one thing that I do want to say as I move on from the measure piece is that people think about cyberbullying as well in terms of how race, is sometimes involved in the cyberbullying experiences. The difference that I want to talk about this is that cyberbullying mostly represents the direct aggression, right? That here is a definition that I took from one of the papers, is this electronic communication to bully a person, right? That there's an intention, there's a threatening intention for this. But in terms of online racism, it's more than that. It involves, right, that direct victimization, but it also includes a lot of vicarious and this mediated exposure that you're not looking for, the harm or the aggression, or people aren't out to sort of really get you in that way, but it just comes to you surreptitiously at times. It just comes to you out of nowhere, right? And it's always there, kind of thing. And so I wanted to draw that distinction a little bit because I think you can study cyberbullying and how race kind of comes into that, but I think online racism itself is more than that. So these are some of the aspects that I believe is different from cyberbullying. And so in terms of how online racism really has been, and I mentioned to you about the relationship, online racism predicting the psychological well-being variables that I mentioned to you about. It was positively related to racism-related stress, racism in the offline setting as well, more on just views of society. And so we start to see some sort of offline perceptual changes of some of these individuals that could be due to online racism as well. Perceived stress, seeing more future events and experiences to be stressful than not. And general psychological distress. And I have this in red because especially for this variable, it was unique beyond, racism in the offline setting. So this kind of gives us the evidence that empirically, there's something unique about online racism as a chronic stressor that needs to be studied further. And so from here on, so you kind of try to take a deeper dive, right? So based on this measure, sort of trying to take a more deeper dive into what are some of the things that we can do, right, in terms of understanding how online racism is impacting people's well-being. Well, I think, even though online racism research is something that is more interdisciplinary, I think research in social media and how online interactions, they are also interdisciplinary, but they also have been, gaining a lot of literature in and of itself, and a lot of things can be taken from there. And so, for example, in violent social media research, there's been a lot of linkages to loneliness, people experiencing greater loneliness as they view violent social media, greater depression, greater aggressive behaviors, greater risky behaviors like alcohol use, suicidal ideation. And the other thing here is that what's also really concerning is this negative perceptual influence that is associated with those negative online experiences. You start to kind of change the way you view the world and the people in the world based on how you experience things on the online or what you see on the internet. And so this attribution bias, and one thing that's been really interesting was that people who see more violent social media or who are more victimized online, they have more heightened sensitivity to hostility, heightened sensitivity to sort of rejecting people. And so it's really becoming also a factor that can really influence how you interact in the social settings in the offline world. And so these are important, right, for online racism research, because if you think about the constant barrage of online racism experiences and contents that you see, how will that impact a racial minority individual, for example, an adolescent or an emerging adult? How will it then, impact their experiences of the world going forward? And so, one thing that a study that we conducted was looking at sort of that anticipatory stress model, where, you know, as you experience more online racism, how does that then lead to how you think about these events, and then how does it lead to your anticipation of certain social interactions in the offline world, and then ultimately what does that do to your well-being? And so here the model kind of predicts that greater online racism leads to more rumination of those events, and then you will actually this predicts that you will actually engage in more offline racism related social vigilance, which is sort of um, mistrusting other individuals, making sure that you avoid certain social situations so you don't get discriminated. So really trying to avoid, right, that interaction, so that you're minimizing the risk of being discriminated. And so then that was actually found to be associated with greater psychological distress, greater alcohol use severity, and greater loneliness. So we begin to see some of the initial evidence of this anticipatory mechanism of how it's impacting then some of the health risks that could come from this. If this process prolongs for many, many years, what does that mean, right? And especially with alcohol use severity, something interesting that we also have been mapping onto current literature of social media and aggression in that literature as well is that I said this before that women actually report greater online racism. And the literature and social media also say that women and girls are more likely to report victimization on the internet. So women are the more, they're victimized at higher rates on the internet based on the literature and studies that are available. And in this study, we also found similar kind of trends here. We were looking at alcohol use as sort of this medicative coping strategy to stress that was generated by online racism. And what we saw here is that for men, only the general psychological distress explained this linkage between online racism and the use of alcohol to kind of cope, perhaps maybe, right, to cope with the psychological distress. But for women, both of these pathways were significant. So suggesting that women also experience significant social media related stress in addition to general psychological distress, which is kind of telling us that they are probably feeling more sort of stress that are coming from maybe potentially the victimization from online racism from their perspective. And this kind of aligns with the current literature as well. And I will talk a little bit more about this later on. So there's more kind of content on this. But before I do that, I want to get into some of the protective factors because it kind of all connects. And so so far I've been talking a lot about the negative and sort of things that exacerbate, right, costs of online racism. But what about protective factors? Because there is a wealth of literature out there based on racism research already that have examined protective factors. For example, racial socialization, right, the way that individuals were, how they developed throughout their childhood and adolescence and teenage years, and how did their parents approach, right, racial issues and racism issues with their kids. And so these are some of the factors here for cultural socialization, preparation for racial bias, promotion of mistrust, and racial silencing, which is not studied too much. But really, cultural socialization is really about instilling racial pride in your kids, right? Preparation for racial bias, it's more about telling your kids that be prepared to face racism because there is going to be racial bias coming your way, right? That's kind of a disdain outlook of the world, but some parents do that. And then there's also promotion of mistrust, where you're asking your kids to be mistrustful for other people, especially those who are different racial backgrounds or white individuals. And then racial silencing is just not talking about racism or race at all, thinking that even talking about it is not a good thing to do. So these are the four aspects that are more talked about in this literature. And usually cultural socialization is associated with more of a buffering, that it helps individuals cope with racism because they are instilled with this racial pride. And whereas the other three, racial silencing is mostly detrimental, and then preparation for bias and promotion of mistrust has mixed benefits. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. So our question was, what about this for the online racism? If based on offline racism experiences, there's a lot of evidence saying that there's potential here. But what about for online racism? Because we know some things are different between the two. Um, so unfortunately, in this study where we looked at sort of online racism leading to alcohol use severity and psychological distress, and how these, racial socialization experiences that people have received over time, how does that moderate that relationship? We actually found that none of the relationships were significant, or that cultural socialization was not a significant buffer of that relationship. The only significant finding we saw here was the preparation for bias and in the relationship between online mediated exposure to racist reality, predicting psychological distress, where those who are at high levels of preparation for bias, meaning they receive the most messages from parents preparing them for racial bias, that the relationship was not significant. But besides that, we did not see any. And so this is actually telling us a little bit about maybe there are different things that needs to be done. So for example, maybe there needs to be more digital focus on these racial socialization strategies, for example. And that's been kind of a slow, right, process where are we as a society really talking about how kids are digitally socialized nowadays? And that's another question for later down the road. The concerning, but one thing's for sure in the study is that if you engage in a lot of racial silencing, it actually exacerbates the cost of online racism as far as in this study goes. And so just this is the, again, whenever there's talk of silence and all that being dangerous, it is true. And if you're parents and you're thinking about race and racism issues with your kids, silencing those topics is not going to have any good benefits as far as in this study goes. And so that was just sort of the reinforcement of that finding in the literature. So we talked about the protective factors there a little bit with racial socialization. We wanted to kind of bring that together now with the outcomes that we talked about, and how does coping with sort of, for example, online racism through maybe support seeking and anti-racism advocacy, how does that then kind of lead to their outcomes, their well-being as well? And so if you go back to the beginning of what I talked about, the positive aspects of internet on racism, it's kind of we're also kind of looking into that a little bit, right? There has been a lot of writing about people using online social spaces as support structures, and also using the online as a way to advocate for issues like this. And so in this study, what we tested was sort of online racism and its relation to online social support seeking for racism experiences, and then also the ability to engage in advocacy. But we looked at this from a more, not just a simple kind of assessing relationship kind of study, but looking at it from a, could there be different patterns of people engaging in these activities based on how they were, raised by their parents on race and racism issues. So the racial socialization messages we just talked about, right? So we conducted a latent class regression analysis here where we're looking at the links between these two, between online racism and the coping outcomes here, but also are there different classes of people based on their racial socialization that differentiate the links of these two, indicators. And then also, do these different classes also report different level of health and maybe even engage in different level of alcohol use based on some of the alcohol use studies that we have conducted so far. And so the results tell us that there are three classes of individuals. And so first, we have the highly activated group, which is that they had significant relations with the online support seeking and advocacy engagement. And they actually reported greatest perceived quality of health than the other two classes here. However, they also had greater risk for increased alcohol use compared to the other two groups here. And demographically speaking, although this is probably not done in the best, and I think the statistics aren't there yet in terms of figuring out really the ultimate possibility of who could be comprised in this group. But based on current literature, it is possible that it's more likely to be comprised of Black men in this group. And so what's interesting here is that it seems that there's greater increased alcohol use that could be associated with more advocacy engagement. We know that advocacy is not always a easy process. It also comes with a lot of burden and stress. That could be one explanation. But we also have to factor in that there's a lot of other factors that we haven't tested that could also be informing the alcohol use here. So just keep that limitation in mind as you digest this result here. The moderate engagement piece, the second group, this group actually had sort of moderate levels of engagement with the online support seeking advocacy compared to the highly activated group. The relationship was still significant, but we didn't really see other indicators here, and it was actually most likely to be comprised of Latinx individuals. The group that I think we should all be really concerned about is the disengaged group. No significant relations at all with online support seeking and advocacy engagement. And this was actually the group that had the only significant differentiation from racial socialization, which was that they received more promotion of mistrust messages from parents growing up, which then probably led them to disengage from engaging in coping strategies. This group reported the greater risk of alcohol use, lowest perceived quality of health, and most likely to be comprised of Black women. And so we are seeing this time and time now, right? Black women at the margins of the intersectional margins of the discrimination and racism they experience, the gendered racism. Again, this is telling us more about their sort of online experiences as well, where they could be at greater risk of disengaging from peers and even engaging in more risky, right, coping strategies. So there needs to be more research on this as well. So that kind of, wraps up some of the findings that I wanted to kind of showcase to you today. And really the research directions here that I think are really important, of course, continuing to really look at risk factors, but also protective factors, right? The digital support systems and advocacy, and that needs to be more sort of, sort of delineated and emphasized in today's society. Really, a lot of attention needs to be paid on identity development and socialization. Think about the kids who are going through this year, adolescents and individuals. How are they going to think of all of the experiences that they had this year in their subsequent years, right? It's going to have additive impact on their self-esteem, their self-actualization, all of that. And I think alongside that is how does it over time, right, shift or skew our world, right? You might have seen that disinformation presentation in the very first one in this series of seminars, but disinformation, we know that it impacts people's beliefs and behaviors as well. And so this is not too distant from that kind of framework. You can think about some online racism experiences and contents of fake information too, right? People just spew out fake information to discriminate people or say something mean to them. But it is racism. And it really impacts how people think about their lives and their sort of social interactions. And then the final piece here is that, yes, those are individual level experiences, but we have to think about how, as a whole of the ecosystem of the internet, how does it then impact the greater, larger ideologies, cultural climate, crime and violence influences that it can have, and ultimately the health and mental health disparities of the individuals who are exposed to all of this frequently and persistently. Here's an example of a former white supremacist telling us, like, no one's doing anything about the online extremism. I think this is more in the news now, right, because of this year, but it's not new, and it's been going on for many, many years. And here's a study that recently came out telling us that hate crimes were higher in US cities with greater prevalence of online racism. And maybe one could wonder, could there be more sort of online mobilizations of these hate ideologies? And then could that actually have an impact on how people behave in the offline world? For racists, maybe this reinforces their motives and beliefs to be racist toward others in the offline world. For victims of racism, there is more disengagement, there's more anticipation of these events and experiences. That's going to drive a further wedge into the social interactions in the offline world too. So I think these things, these questions can really be tackled in multi-level analysis, geotagging studies, and social network analysis as a couple of the approaches here. And our team is actually working on a study right now looking at the hate crime data, and I think 2019 data just came out, how that over time influences violence at at different levels of the units, at the individual and organizational. And so, that we're really looking forward to how the norms really govern the violent structures in this country. But I'll leave you with this final point here is that, again, all of these things are not just being developed on the internet on their own. It is a reflection of our society. And we really cannot forget that all of this research has to be done in tandem with how people behave or think about things in society and how it actually plays out on the internet as well. So research and advocacy must be done in conjunction to sort of that critical reflection of what's really going on with racial dynamics in our society. If anything, it has really revealed what's going on under the hood in our society on the internet than not. So really the interdisciplinary piece is key here. We need people in technology, people in policy and social science to all come together to really be able to tackle this issue. And so I hope that this was a sort of a nice presentation for you to get into some of the information about what I'm doing and what the field has been moving to. So thanks again for all of the attending this talk. And if you ever have any questions or want to reach out for more discussion, please feel free to do so. Here's my email. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keum, for an interesting talk with a lot of research to continue to explore. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll read them to you. I'm going to combine two. One is from Jeffrey Tardaguila, and he asks, usually studies take several years. How long have your studies taken? It's a good question, especially the type of studies you're doing. And another question from Shannon Chung, who asks, I imagine that your theory and conceptualization of online racism might be applicable to other forms of oppression, such as sexism and misogyny. Wondering if you've examined or plan to examine the intersectional online experience of women of color, considering that they may experience increased exposure to sexualization/fetishization.
Yeah, great, really, great questions. And then I'll attend to the first one about the first with the how long does it take to do these studies? And so, I mean, I started studying this since 2012, and these were the collection of studies that I was able to, conduct and sort of, analyze and publish and so on. It takes quite a bit, and I think that is actually one of the challenges. I think is that the social media and then the technology moves so fast that once you start doing something on this topic, the next thing you know it, there's something new coming up. So how do you then kind of adapt to that as well with your research? And so one thing that we've been focusing is to really focus on the experiences that could be more sort of robust throughout these changes, though, right? Including the ways that people interact, the perceptions of the people, rather than the contents and the structures themselves. And so those are some of the ways that you could actually sort of include that can also have lasting impact on sort of the evidence that you find in these studies. But I think it's also something where I think academic field as a whole probably needs to do a better job of moving the research faster and putting out the results faster too, and being able to talk about them in a very lay term so that the public can also be involved, or people from other disciplines can also be involved in terms of creating really effective interdisciplinary research. And so I think if you are able to, and what a lot of researchers usually do is that they get a group of, well, they collect a large amount of data at once, and then they are able to go through all of their research questions. So you might see spurts of research coming out in certain years, whereas in certain years it's going to be more preparation, and so that's going to take time where you're not really putting out research. But I think that's why collaboration is key. I think being able to collaborate with more people, you have more avenues to really get these results out, because you don't have to be the one who's always doing spearheading everything or organizing everything. So I think those are some of the things that I would say. With respect to the question from Shannon, this is a great question because I think it also goes to some of what I talked about in the last research that I talked about with Black women. Most likely to be in that group with the disengaged coping engagement, and how there's greater alcohol use severity, lowest perceived quality of health. And so that is a limitation of that study, is that we did not look at the intersectional experiences of online oppression, rather just the racism piece. And so that there needs to be more intersectional approach to assessing these experiences. And so we are actually developing more scales that are going to look at this. And so yes, we do plan to look at this, but again, right, it's not a fast process because we try to be as rigorous as possible, try to incorporate the most appropriate theory, but it's not something where it just it's going to happen like month to month. But I think it takes time to really build up that framework, and so hopefully we'll be able to get there. But if you if you feel like you would want to talk to me more about this, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you. We know how long it takes to develop and build a really strong measure, one that's reliable and valid. So that takes quite some time. And I wondered if there were kind of measures or constructs that you feel are currently lacking in the psychological literature that you would like to explore further. You talked about developing some newer scales. What are some of those newer scales?
So one thing that I would say is I think there needs to be more, and something that I would really want to see as being developed into scale is sort of how are individuals kind of being socialized to work with social media, to work with internet, in terms of their racial being and their racial identity. And this goes for both people who are growing up, as well as the parents who are also involved in the process too. What is their literacy and the level of competence in being able to critically sort of socialize their children to be critical consumers and critical producers of these contents? And so I think that has to be really a focal point. And I think, and I don't know if many of you saw Social Dilemma, that was a show on Netflix. One thing that I would say that that wasn't surprising to me was that these things were developed without any anticipation of what would happen in those dynamics. And so it's almost like studying things after the fact that it has happened already, which is really unfortunate. But I think this is why measures like this is really helpful. But I think if we are able to also collaborate with computer scientists and technology, professionals, we can also develop more real-time measures that are not just self-report, but also involves technology and smartphones and so on. So there's a lot of researchers out there looking at using smartphones to assess the things that they're exposed to on the internet, the way that their emotions change due to what they have seen on the internet. So it's really fascinating. And so I think that has to also happen in tandem to be able to really get at the psychometrically valid aspects of those experiences.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. We're a little bit after 10.
Right.
A lot of fascinating work that you're engaged in. And again, appreciate you coming and joining us and being part of this cyber psychology seminar series. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is the last scheduled seminar for this semester, which I'm sad about, and now thinking maybe I'll add some more before the end of the semester, but probably not. Definitely in the spring. Stay tuned for more cyber psychology seminars. I put in the chat in the beginning of Dr. Keum's talk the link to subscribe to our announcement mailing list, the link to follow us on Eventbrite, as well as a YouTube channel, the Cyber Psychology Center YouTube channel. Dr. Keum's talk will be up on that channel right now. There are 2 of the seminar lectures that are currently have been uploaded, and I'll continue to do that so you can have access to these wonderful lectures. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Dr. Keum also put his email if you have other questions. It looks like there may be other questions from folks for you. So thank you again, and be well and have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.